The city was cold the way Moscow is always cold in December. Not the polite cold of a winter evening, but the kind that presses through walls, through wool, through bone. Snow had been falling since the previous night, muffling the streets around the Kremlin in a silence that felt, to those who knew how to read it, less like peace and more like held breath. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, a convoy of black cars pulled up outside a government apartment building on one of the narrow inner streets that the ordinary citizens of Moscow never had reason to visit. The men who stepped out wore long coats and expressions that gave nothing away. They had a warrant, they had orders, and they had been waiting, in some of them for years, for precisely this moment. The man they had come for was 56 years old. He was broad-shouldered, thick-necked, with the kind of face that had been carved by decades of watchfulness. Eyes that never stopped moving, jaw that never fully unclenched. Lieutenant General Nikolai Vlasic. For 25 years, he'd been the most powerful, invisible man in the Soviet Union. He had stood closer to Joseph Stalin than any politician, any general, any family member. He had slept in the room next to the dictator's bedroom. He had tasted Stalin's food before Stalin ate it. He had chosen who could approach the leader and who could not. In a country built on fear, he had been the keeper of the fear behind the fear. Now, as the knock landed on his door, Vlasic already knew. A man who had spent a quarter century in the machinery of state terror did not require an explanation when that machinery turned toward him. He dressed. He did not resist. He was led out of the building and into the black cars, and the convoy moved through the snow without ceremony, without spectacle. Just another disappearance in a city that had learned not to notice disappearances. What investigators found during the search of his apartment became the official cornerstone of the case against him. 14 cameras, 3 motion picture devices, classified documents. The prosecution's interpretation was immediate and unambiguous. Espionage, here they declared, was the proof of betrayal. Here was evidence that the man entrusted with protecting the Soviet state had been systematically photographing its secrets and preparing to hand them to enemies. It was, of course, nonsense, and almost everyone in the room knew it. Vlasic had been a passionate amateur photographer for decades. The cameras were a hobby, perhaps an obsession, the documentation of a life spent in the shadow of history. The classified documents were almost certainly materials that had passed through his hands in the routine exercise of his duties over more than 2 decades at the apex of Soviet power. But in the winter of 1952 and the final paranoid spiral of Stalin's reign, facts were not the point. The point was the charge. The point was the file. The point was that a man's life could be rewritten in an afternoon if the right people decided it was time. The interrogation room, what followed the arrest, was a methodical dismantling of a human being. For the next 3 months, from December of 1952 through the beginning of March of 1953, Vlasic was interrogated almost every single day. He was held in solitary confinement. He was kept in handcuffs inside his cell. The investigators who sat across from him in those bare, bright rooms were not interested in the truth. They were interested in a specific document, a confession. Not just any confession, but a confession that would tie Vlasic to a broader conspiracy, that would implicate others, that would serve the political needs of whoever had engineered this arrest. On at least 2 separate occasions, according to accounts that emerged only after the machinery of Soviet secrecy began to crack, the interrogators staged mock executions. Vlasic was brought before what appeared to be a firing squad. He was made to stand there, to look at the rifles aimed at him, to understand or believe that the next seconds would be his last. Then nothing happened. He was returned to his cell. This was not incompetence. This was technique. The purpose was to break a man's psychological resistance so completely that he would sign anything, say anything, become whatever his captors required him to be. He did not break. Not fully. Not in the way they needed. In his memoirs, written years later, in a voice that still carries the bewilderment of a man trying to understand the incomprehensible, Vlasic wrote, I was severely hurt by Stalin. For 25 years of doing an irreproachable job, receiving nothing but encouragement and awards, I was excluded from the party and flung into prison for my boundless fidelity. He gave me into the charge of my enemies, but never for any minute of the condition I was in to whatever mockeries I was exposed while in prison, had I in my soul any malice against Stalin. Read that sentence again. Hold it. A man who has been subjected to staged executions, who has been chained in a cell, who has been interrogated daily for months, and he writes that he holds no malice against the person who allowed it to happen. There is something in that loyalty that is almost impossible to categorize. Is it nobility? Is it pathology? Is it the particular deformation that occurs when a human being has surrendered so completely to another human being that even betrayal cannot break the bond? That question, that central haunting question, is what this investigation is really about. A prophecy nobody wanted to hear. Before his arrest, before the black cars came, Vlassic had said something that the people around him dismissed as the vanity of an aging security chief who had come to believe his own importance. He said, "If I am gone, Stalin will not last long either." It was the kind of remark that gets attributed to powerful men after history has proven them right. But consider the specific timeline. Vlassic was arrested on December 15, 1952. 79 days later, on March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin was dead. Not 79 years, 79 days. The formal Soviet account was that Stalin suffered a stroke during the night of March 1st to March 2nd. His guards, finding his door still closed late into the following day, far past the hour when he normally summoned someone, stood outside and did not enter. They had no protocol for this. The man who had built the protocols, who had trained the guards, who had established every rule governing who entered that room and when, was sitting in a prison cell on the other side of Moscow. The household had been restructured after his removal. The new arrangements had not been tested. Nobody wanted to be the person who opened the door without being summoned, because in Stalin's Kremlin, the wrong initiative could end a career or a life. Stalin lay there for what witnesses later placed at approximately 22 hours before anyone entered to help him. By then, nothing could be helped, whether Vlasic's prophecy was insight or coincidence, wisdom or luck. We cannot say with certainty. But the fact remains. The man who had protected Stalin for 25 years was removed from his post, and within less than 3 months, the most powerful figure in Soviet history was gone, found collapsed alone in a building full of people who were too afraid to check on him. The central question: this is not simply a story about one man's fall from grace. It is a story about the nature of power and the peculiar, devastating intimacy that power creates between the person who holds it and the person whose entire existence is built around protecting it. Nikolai Vlasik was not a philosopher. He was not an intellectual. By almost every account from those who knew him, and we will hear from those accounts in detail, he was a rough man, practical man, a man of physical presence and operational instinct rather than reflective depth. He had received 3 years of education at a parish school in a village in the Grodno Governorate of the Russian Empire. He had spent his adolescence as a day laborer. He had arrived at the heights of Soviet power not through brilliance or ideology, but through loyalty so absolute and service so total that the machinery of the state had simply incorporated him, the way a growing tree incorporates a fence, and then the state had discarded him, as it discards everyone eventually. The arrest of Nikolai Vlasik on December 15, 1952 is the end of our story. But to understand it, truly understand it, in all its human weight and historical complexity, we must go back to the beginning, to a village called Bobinichi, to a peasant boy who lost his parents early and started work before he was old enough to have formed a clear idea of what work was, to the strange, violent, transformative century that took that boy and turned him step by step into the most trusted man in the most secretive government on earth. We must understand who Nikolai Vlasik was before we can understand what was done to him, and we must understand what was done to him before we can understand what it tells us, not just about the Soviet Union, not just about Stalin, but about something older and more universal, the price of proximity to power, and the question of whether loyalty to a system that will eventually consume you is courage or something else entirely. The interrogation light is on. The snow is still falling outside. Let us begin. There is a village in what is now western Belarus, in the Grodno region, not far from the town of Slonim, that most maps do not bother to name. In the final decades of the Russian Empire, it was called Bobinichi, and it was the kind of place that produced nothing that empires tend to record. No monuments, no famous battles, no names that appear in textbooks. It produced grain and mud and children and poverty. Into that poverty, on the 22nd of May in the year 1896, Nikolai Sidorovich Vlasic was born. His parents were peasants, not peasants in the romantic literary sense, not the salt-of-the-earth figures that Russian novelists like to invoke, but peasants in the grinding, exhausting, horizonless sense of people who owned almost nothing, who worked land that was not theirs, who measured their lives not in ambitions but in harvests and illnesses, and the distance between one winter and the next. Nikolai lost them before he was old enough to form a clear memory of either. By the age of 3, he was an orphan. Stop for a moment and hold that fact. 3 years old, in a village with no infrastructure, no social safety net, no system of care beyond whatever relatives or neighbors were willing or able to provide. The Russia of the late 19th century had no vocabulary for what we would now call childhood trauma. You were simply handed the world as it was, and you either found a way to survive in it or you did not. Nikolai Vlasik found a way. He attended the local parish school, a one-room institution where a priest or a literate elder taught the children of the village their letters and basic arithmetic in between their religious duties. He completed 3 classes. That was the entirety of his formal education. Not 3 years, 3 classes. By the time he was done, he could read, haltingly. He could write his name. He understood numbers well enough to count what little there was to count. And then school was over, not because he had graduated, but because there was nothing more to graduate into and no money to pursue anything further, and because the village needed hands more than it needed scholars. He was 13 years old when he began working. The education that schools cannot give the work Vlasic took was the work that waits at the bottom of every economy for those with nothing to offer but their physical presence. He dug, he hauled, he carried, he labored for landowners on their estates, then moved to railway construction, one of the enormous infrastructure projects that the Russian Empire was pushing across its vast territories in those years, where men with strong backs and no particular future were always in demand. He worked as a loader at a paper mill in Yekaterinoslav, a city in what is now Ukraine. This was not the education of books and ideas, but it was an education, moving from place to place, working beside men from dozens of different backgrounds, nationalities, and circumstances. A young man learns things that no classroom teaches: how to read a room, how to gauge the intentions of strangers, how to be useful enough that people keep you on when they could just as easily send you away. He learned patience. He learned observation. He learned, perhaps most importantly, how to make himself indispensable without making himself threatening. These were, as it turned out, precisely the skills that the 20th century most richly rewarded. In March of 1915, the Russian Empire drafted him into its army. The war that had been sweeping across Europe had already consumed millions of lives, and the Russian military command, like all military commands in that conflict, had discovered that the supply of human beings willing to fight was not in fact unlimited and required constant replenishment from the villages and cities of the interior. Vlasic went. He was not an officer. He was not educated enough, well-connected enough, or wealthy enough to hold a commission. He served as a junior, non-commissioned officer, a corporal, then a sergeant. doing the specific, unglamorous, absolutely essential work of keeping men organized and moving in conditions of extreme fear and chaos. And somewhere in those years of mud and noise and cold, he earned the Cross of St. George. The Cross of St. George was not given lightly. It was the Russian Empire's military decoration for conspicuous acts of bravery in the face of the enemy. Specifically, it was awarded to enlisted men and non-commissioned officers, as a deliberate acknowledgement that courage was not the exclusive property of the officer class. What exactly Vlasic did to earn his cross, the historical record does not tell us in detail, but the act itself tells us something. This was a man who, when the moment demanded it, did not step back. Revolution, Red Army, and the machinery of the new state. By the time the October Revolution came in November of 1917, Vlasic was 21 years old, a veteran, an orphan, a laborer's son with 3 years of parish schooling and a military medal. He had nothing to lose in the old order and no particular attachment to its continuation. When the Bolsheviks came to power, he made his choice. He joined the Moscow militia in November of 1917, essentially a revolutionary police force learning on the job as the new state tried to build itself on the rubble of the old. In 1918, he served as a Red Army soldier, participating in the defense of Tsaritsyn, the city on the Volga that would later be renamed Stalingrad, where the Bolsheviks fought desperately against White Army forces. It was there, in those chaotic early months of the Civil War, that a certain Georgian revolutionary named Joseph Stalin, already known by his adopted name, Stalin, was playing a significant political and military role. Whether Vlasic's path crossed Stalin's at Tsaritsyn, we do not know, but the geography is not irrelevant. In November of 1918, he joined the Bolshevik Party, the organization that would, within a decade, become the singular controlling force of the largest country on earth. In September of 1919, he transferred to the Cheka. That transfer was a threshold. On one side of it was a former peasant laborer, a soldier, a provincial man making his way through the noise of revolution. On the other side was something altogether different, a member of the most feared organization in the new Soviet state, the instrument of its internal security, the body charged with identifying, pursuing, and neutralizing the enemies, real, suspected, imagined, of the revolution. The Cheka, under its founder Felix Dzerzhinsky, operated on a principle that it stated openly and without apology. The security of the revolution was more important than the rights of individuals. Dzerzhinsky himself, a Polish nobleman turned Bolshevik fanatic, a man who had spent years in Tsarist prisons and emerged with both a destroyed body and an unshakable conviction, built an institution in his own image, ascetic, ruthless, ideologically inflexible, and absolutely certain of its own righteousness. Vlasic served under that institution. He absorbed its culture. He learned its methods. He understood from the inside how a state that defines its own survival as the highest moral good treats the human beings who stand in its way. It is one of the deeper ironies of his story that the system he helped to build would one day be the system that devoured him. The appointment that changed everything. By January of 1926, Vlasic had risen to become a senior operative in the operations department of the OGPU, the successor to the Cheka, the unit specifically responsible for protecting party and state leaders. He was 30 years old. He had traveled in less than a decade from a railway construction site in Yekaterinoslav to the inner operational corridors of Soviet power. Then came 1927. The exact circumstances of Vlasic's appointment as Stalin's personal bodyguard vary slightly across different accounts, but the essential fact is not disputed. In 1927, Nikolai Vlasik was assigned to the personal protection of the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He was not yet the chief of the entire security apparatus. He was at first simply the man who stood closest to Stalin, the man who walked beside him, who sat in the adjacent room, who tracked the movements of everyone who came near. He was, in the language of his profession, the principal's shadow. What the records cannot fully capture is the specific alchemy of those first months and years. Stalin was not an easy man. He was suspicious by nature and paranoid by calculation. A leader who had watched rivals fall and enemies multiply, who trusted almost no one and tested everyone, who would years later liquidate entire circles of people simply because proximity to power creates, over time, knowledge that power cannot afford to have widely distributed. For Vlassic to survive in that environment, let alone thrive in it, required something more than competence. It required the ability to disappear while remaining present, to be useful without being ambitious, to know everything without appearing to think about what he knew, to be, in the most complete sense, a tool that the hand did not have to think about picking up. It was simply there when needed. The peasant boy from Bobinichi, who had learned since the age of 3 how to survive in environments that had no particular interest in his survival, turned out to be very good at exactly that. He would remain in that position, closer to the center of Soviet power than any marshal, any minister, any member of the Politburo, for the next 25 years. The question that history asks and that we're here to examine is not simply how he got there. The question is what it costs a man to live that life, what it does to a person to spend a quarter century as the shadow of a tyrant, what it means to know, as Vlasic undeniably knew, the full private dimension of absolute power, its cruelties, its vanities, its fears, its silences. The boy from Bobinichi saw everything. He remembered everything. And when the moment came, that memory made him not powerful, but dangerous. And dangerous men in Stalin's Moscow did not stay free for long. There is a word in Russian, nezaменяемый, that translates roughly as irreplaceable. It is a word that Soviet culture used with caution because the ideology of collectivism insisted that no individual was truly irreplaceable, that the system was always greater than any one person within it. Stalin himself liked to say that there are no irreplaceable people. He said it often, sometimes warmly, sometimes as a warning, and yet for 25 years he kept Nikolai Vlasik, not because he had to, not because the bureaucratic machinery prevented him from making a change. Stalin replaced marshals, ministers, secretaries, lovers, and old friends with a regularity that made the people around him live in a state of permanent, low-level dread. He replaced them when they disappointed him, when they knew too much, when they had served their purpose, when someone more useful appeared on the horizon, and sometimes for reasons that no one, then or now, could fully explain. He did not replace Vlasic, not for 25 years. To understand why, you have to understand what Vlasic actually did, because the title of bodyguard is profoundly misleading. It evokes a man in a suit standing near a door, which is to say it evokes approximately 5% of the reality. The other 95% was something closer to the role of a chief of staff, a household manager, a logistics director, a social secretary, and a surrogate family member, all compressed into one rough, watchful, absolutely loyal man, the architect of Stalin's private world. From the earliest years of his assignment, Vlasic understood something that more formally educated men sometimes fail to grasp, that power is not only exercised in meetings and decrees, power is also exercised through comfort, routine, and the elimination of friction. A leader who's well-fed, well-rested, and free from the petty mechanical anxieties of daily life is a leader who can concentrate entirely on domination. A leader constantly distracted by bad food, unreliable staff, or logistical disorder is a leader whose attention is divided. Vlasic eliminated every possible distraction. He personally supervised the hiring and vetting of every cook who prepared Stalin's food, a task that involved not merely checking credentials, but running full security assessments on every individual who might come within reach of what Stalin ate and drank. He established supply chains for provisions, ensuring that the quality of ingredients met standards that he himself set and personally verified. He did not trust this to subordinates. He checked, he tasted, he inspected. He built and oversaw the system of government dachas, the network of country residences outside Moscow where Stalin spent enormous portions of his time, particularly in his later years when his relationship with the Kremlin itself became more complicated and his preference for the semi-isolation of the suburban villa grew stronger. The nearby dacha, the Blizhnaya, at Kuntsevo, which became Stalin's primary residence in the final decade of his life, was organized and maintained under Vlasic's direct supervision. Every guard who walked those grounds, every staff member who moved through those corridors, every technical system that operated in those buildings, all of it ran through Vlassic. He designed and continuously refined the system of secure automobile transportation that protected Stalin's movements through Moscow. The practice of using multiple identical vehicles moving in coordinated formation so that any potential attacker could not identify which car carried the protected individual was developed and formalized under his watch. The protocols he created for Stalin's road movements became the template for Soviet state security transportation, and variations of those protocols persist in the protection of heads of state to this day. This was not a man standing near a door. This was a man who had built the door, chosen who made the door, tested the lock, trained the person who turned the key, and stood watch over everything that happened on both sides of it. The November that changed the house. In November of 1932, Stalin's wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, was found dead in her Kremlin apartment. She was 31 years old. The official account was a heart attack. The real account, which filtered through Soviet society and whispers that became louder only decades later, was that she had taken her own life. There had been an argument. Some accounts place it at a dinner party the previous evening where Stalin had said something contemptuous and public in her direction, something she could neither forgive nor answer. She went home. Sometime in the night, she died. What this meant for the practical organization of Stalin's household was significant. Nadezhda had been a presence, a counterweight, a person of her own character and connections, who occupied a structural role in the family's life. With her gone, that role collapsed, and the space it left behind was filled, imperfectly, awkwardly, but consistently, by Vlasic. He became, in the years following Nadezhda's death, the primary non-political adult figure in the lives of Stalin's children. Svetlana, the youngest, was 6 years old when her mother died. Vasily was 11. Artyom Sergeyev, not a biological son, but the child of a dead comrade whom Stalin had informally adopted, was also part of the household. Vlasic organized their schooling, their meals, their transport, their recreational activities. He was the person who made sure they were safe when their father was occupied, which was most of the time. He was the adult who showed up when the adult who was supposed to show up did not. Two portraits, one man history, has given us two sharply different portraits of Vlasic in this domestic role, and the contradiction between them is itself illuminating. The first portrait comes from Svetlana Alliluyeva, Stalin's daughter who defected to the West in 1967 and published memoirs that became one of the most significant insider accounts of life inside the Stalin household. Svetlana described Vlasic as a coarse and semi-literate grandee. In her telling, he was a man whose sudden proximity to power had inflated both his ego and his appetites, a rough provincial who used his position to accumulate privileges and who treated the people around him with the casual contempt of someone who had learned that access to Stalin was its own form of authority. She did not like him. She did not trust him. She saw clearly and with the sharp eye of someone who grew up inside the machinery, the ways in which power had distorted the man. The second portrait comes from Artyom Sergeyev, Stalin's adopted son who lived inside the household through those years and who gave interviews late in his life that historians have found revealing. Sergeyev described Vlasic in almost opposite terms. A man of absolute professional dedication, someone who had subordinated every personal consideration to the execution of his responsibilities, who was loyal not merely as a performance but as a genuine orientation of his entire being. Both of these portraits are probably accurate. They are not describing different men. They are describing the same man from different angles, in the way that a rough stone looks entirely different depending on where the light falls. What Svetlana saw was the corruption that proximity to absolute power tends to produce. Vlasic had access. He had influence. He could make things happen and prevent things from happening. Over decades, that kind of access does something to a person, particularly a person who began with nothing, who came from a village where 3 years of parish school was considered an education. The temptations were real, and the evidence suggests he did not always resist them. What Sergeyev saw was the devotion that is also real, and that coexisted with the corruption without canceling it out. Vlasic believed in what he was doing. He believed in Stalin, not as a political abstraction, but as a specific human being whose safety and well-being were his personal responsibility. When Stalin ate, Vlasic had tasted the food. When Stalin traveled, Vlasic had cleared the route. When Stalin's children needed something, Vlasic was the person they could reach. That is not nothing. In the brutal calculus of Soviet life, it was, in fact, a great deal. The shadow that carried weight. By the 1940s, Vlasic's position had formalized into something with genuine institutional weight. He was head of the main directorate for the protection of the leader, the organization responsible for Stalin's personal security and the security of the senior Soviet leadership more broadly. He held the rank of lieutenant general. He commanded thousands of personnel. He controlled, in practical terms, who could physically reach Stalin, which meant in a political system built around personal access that he controlled something more fundamental than most people with official titles could claim. Ministers who needed to see Stalin could be delayed. Information that needed to reach Stalin could be filtered. Requests that required Stalin's attention could be accelerated or slowed, based on decisions made by the man whose official function was simply to keep the leader safe. This was not conspiracy. It was not malice. It was the simple, structural reality of what it means to control access to power. The person who decides who gets in the room decides in a very real sense what happens in the room. Foreign diplomats who visited Moscow in those years noted the phenomenon without always being able to name it. There was a man, always present, always watching, never speaking unless spoken to, who seemed to occupy a category that the formal protocols of Soviet officialdom did not quite account for. Not a minister, not a general in the conventional sense. Something harder to define, something closer. Vlasic was the last layer of insulation between Stalin and the world. He was the final filter, and filters, as any engineer will tell you, accumulate everything that passes through them. After 25 years, Nikolai Vlasik knew things. He knew about the private conversations, the moments of doubt, the relationships that were never made official, the decisions that history would record one way and that he had witnessed another way entirely. He knew the leader's fears, and a man who knows the tyrant's fears is, in the tyrant's calculus, not an asset, but a liability. The day was coming when Stalin, or those who claimed to act in his name, would decide that what Vlasic knew was more dangerous than what Vlasic could still offer, but that day was not yet. First, there was a war to survive, and survival in the years between 1941 and 1945 would require every skill that the boy from Bobanichi had spent a lifetime accumulating. There are moments in a person's career that compress everything they have learned into a single, sustained examination. No rehearsal, no second attempt. The result is recorded permanently in the archive that history keeps with a thoroughness that no individual can control or revise. For Nikolai Vlasik, that examination began on the 22nd of June, 1941. The morning the German Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border in the largest land invasion in recorded history. Operation Barbarossa did not simply threaten the Soviet Union as a state. It threatened the specific human being whose protection was Vlasic's entire professional reason for existing. Stalin, in the first hours and days after the invasion, was, by nearly every account of the period, not the composed, iron-willed commander that Soviet propaganda would later construct. He was a man in shock, a man who had dismissed warnings, a man who had told himself and his generals and his diplomats that the Germans would not come, not yet, perhaps not at all, and who now faced the reality that he had been catastrophically wrong. In those first paralyzed days, as the Soviet military command tried to process the scale of what was happening, Vlasic was not paralyzed. He could not afford to be. His function was not to make strategic decisions. His function was to ensure that the person who made strategic decisions remained alive to make them. And in the summer of 1941, with German armored divisions cutting through Soviet defenses, with a speed that made the collapse visible on maps updated by the hour, keeping Stalin alive required moving him, and moving him without creating the appearance of flight, without generating the kind of signal that enemy intelligence services were watching for, and without communicating to the Soviet population that their leader had relocated to safer ground. The evacuation that was not supposed to happen. In mid-October of 1941, German forces were close enough to Moscow that the Soviet government made the decision, kept as secret as anything could be kept in wartime, to begin evacuating key personnel and institutions eastward, primarily to Kuybyshev, the Volga city designated as the alternative capital if Moscow fell. Vlasic organized the physical logistics of this evacuation for the leadership, the movement of people, documents, materials, the establishment of secure facilities at the destination, the routing and timing of transport that minimized the window of vulnerability, the coordination of protective personnel who would travel with the principals and those who would remain to secure the abandoned facilities. Stalin himself did not leave Moscow. He stayed. That decision, whether it reflected courage, calculation, or some combination of the two, became one of the central symbolic facts of the Soviet wartime narrative. But the decision to stay was made possible in part because Vlasic had made staying safe. The facilities around Moscow were hardened. The underground bunker system was prepared. The movements of the leader within the city were tightened and disguised. If Stalin was going to remain in a city that might fall under siege, then everything around him had to be constructed to absorb that reality. Vlasic constructed it. Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam, the summit circuit, the great wartime conferences where the Allied leaders met to coordinate strategy and negotiate the shape of the post-war world presented Vlasic with a set of challenges that were, in some ways, more complex than anything a domestic security environment required. At the Tehran Conference in November and December of 1943, where Stalin met for the first time face-to-face with Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, Vlasic was operating in an environment that he did not control. Foreign intelligence services were present, foreign security details were operating. The physical facilities were not of Soviet construction and had not been vetted by Soviet personnel from the ground up. The composition of the surrounding population included individuals whose loyalties, training, and capabilities were unknown. There was, in Tehran, a genuine and documented concern about a potential assassination attempt on the Allied leaders. German intelligence, under Operation Long Jump, had reportedly dispatched agents to Tehran with orders to disrupt the conference and eliminate its participants. The extent to which this plot was real, partially real, or substantially a Soviet fabrication designed to justify housing. Roosevelt inside the Soviet compound remains debated by historians to this day. What is not debated is that Vlasic treated the threat as real and structured the security arrangements accordingly. Roosevelt ended up staying in the Soviet compound in close proximity to Stalin, rather than at the American legation across the city. Whether this was purely a security precaution or whether it also served the Soviet interest in keeping Roosevelt in an environment that Soviet intelligence could more readily monitor is a question that the documents do not settle. What Vlasic knew and what he surely understood is that security and intelligence gathering are never fully separable functions. and that a protected environment is also always an observed one. The Yalta Conference in February of 1945 and the Potsdam Conference in July of that year followed similar patterns. Different cities, different configurations, different interlocutors, but the same essential task. Keep the man alive, control the environment, anticipate the threats that have not yet announced themselves. For his work at these conferences, and for his broader service during the war years, Vlasic received 3 military orders. He received them without ceremony, commensurate with what he had actually done, because what he had actually done could not be fully described in public documents without revealing operational details that remained classified. The awards were acknowledgement of something that the acknowledgement could not properly name. The incident at Gagra, a story with 2 endings. In the summer of 1935, before the war, but worth examining here because it illuminates the structural ambiguity that ran through Vlasic's entire career. Stalin was vacationing on the Black Sea coast near the town of Gagra, in what is now Abkhazia. He was on a motorboat on the water when shots were fired. The official account that circulated afterward was that border guards, failing to recognize the vessel, opened fire by mistake. Nobody was hit. The incident was classified, discussed in whispers, and never formally investigated in any way that produced publicly available conclusions. But there was a second account, a darker account, one that placed responsibility for the incident not on confused border guards, but on deliberate action connected in this version of events to Lavrentiy Beria, who was at that time the first secretary of the Georgian Communist Party and already building the apparatus of relationships and leverage that would eventually make him one of the most powerful and most feared men in the Soviet Union. In the Beria version of the Gagra incident, the shooting was not an accident. It was a test or a provocation or an attempt, depending on which fragment of the account you find most credible. Orchestrated by a man who was already thinking about the chessboard several moves ahead, who understood that proximity to Stalin was the ultimate currency of Soviet power, and who had identified Vlasic as the primary obstacle between himself and that proximity. Vlasic, in this version, had responded to the shots with the trained instinct of a security professional, shielding Stalin, directing evasive action, getting the boat to safety. He had, depending on how you read it, either protected his principal from a threat or been the instrument through which Beria demonstrated to Stalin that threats existed and required Beria's particular expertise to manage. The 2 men, Vlasic and Beria, hated each other. This is one of the few facts about their relationship that all accounts agree on. The hatred was professional, personal, and structural. They competed for the same resource, closeness to Stalin. They represented different approaches to the same function. Security as loyal service in Vlasic's conception versus security as political instrument in Beria's. They understood each other perfectly and trusted each other not at all. The Gagra incident, whatever its true nature, was the first clear signal that this rivalry was not merely personal. It had operational dimensions. It would have consequences, what the medals do not say. Vlasic came out of the war years decorated, institutionally powerful, and more deeply embedded in Stalin's world than ever. He had proven across the most extreme test available that his professional skills were real. The systems he had built, the protection protocols, the transportation security, the residential security apparatus, the conference security architecture, had worked. The man he was responsible for had survived, but the war had also changed the landscape around him in ways that would, over the following years, become lethal. The men who had risen during the war, who had accumulated military glory, political capital, and the confidence that comes from having operated at enormous scale under enormous pressure, were not content to return to purely administrative roles. The post-war Soviet hierarchy was a compressed space full of ambitious, dangerous people who had spent years learning how to make consequential decisions quickly and ruthlessly. Among them, none was more dangerous than the man from Georgia with the pale eyes and the meticulous handwriting and the memory for details that never let a slight go unanswered. Lavrentiy Beria had been watching, collecting, waiting, and Vlassic, who had built his career on knowing when threats were approaching, was about to discover that the most dangerous threats are the ones that come from inside the system you spent your life defending. Power in its rawest form does not share space gracefully. It tolerates partners when it must, accommodates rivals when it has no choice, and waits, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, for the moment when the balance shifts enough to allow the final move. The rivalry between Nikolai Vlasik and Lavrentiy Beria was not a quarrel between two difficult personalities who failed to get along. It was a structural conflict between two men who occupied incompatible positions in the same ecosystem, who understood exactly what the other represented, and who knew with the clarity that only genuine professionals possess that the resolution would eventually be total. One of them would destroy the other. The only question was when. Beria had arrived in Moscow in 1938, summoned from Tbilisi, where he had run the Transcaucasian security apparatus with an efficiency that attracted Stalin's attention and satisfied Stalin's growing appetite for a security chief who would execute without hesitation and without the complications of personal loyalty to anyone other than the leader. He replaced Nikolai Yezhov as head of the NKVD, the same Yezhov who had presided over the most intensive period of the Great Terror, and who was himself arrested, tried, and executed in the same machinery he had operated. Beria watched Yezhov's fate carefully and drew the correct lessons. From the moment Beria arrived in Moscow, the conflict with Vlasic was inevitable. They both needed the same thing, unmediated access to Stalin. Vlasic had it by virtue of his physical function. He was the man who stood closest, who controlled the residential environment, who decided who approached. Beria had it by virtue of his institutional function. He ran the state security apparatus, which meant that the intelligence reaching Stalin, the threats being identified, and the enemies being processed all flowed through his organization. Two men, two forms of access. One leader who cultivated dependency and distrust in equal measure, and who, consciously or not, benefited from the tension between them. The architecture of destruction Beria was not a man who acted on impulse. He was methodical in a way that the historical record makes almost uncomfortably clear. A collector of information, a builder of files, a patient assembler of the specific kinds of material that, in the Soviet legal and political environment, could be converted at the right moment into charges, confessions, and sentences. He began building his case against Vlasic long before 1952. The approach was layered. The first layer was behavioral intelligence, the documentation of Vlasic's personal conduct in ways that could be characterized when needed as evidence of moral corruption incompatible with his position. Vlasic was not a monk. He drank as many men of his generation and background drank, heavily, socially, with the lack of self-consciousness about it that was common in Soviet security culture. He had relationships with women, multiple, overlapping, not always conducted with what a formal morality tribunal would recognize as propriety. He used his position to obtain privileges, access to goods, facilities, and services that were not technically his entitlement, but that flowed naturally to a man of his institutional reach. None of this was unusual in the senior Soviet apparatus. All of it was being written down. The second layer was operational, finding or manufacturing specific incidents that could be presented as derelictions of duty. In 1948, a significant piece appeared in this construction. The commandant of the nearby dacha, one of the men in Vlasic's direct operational chain, was subjected to interrogation under conditions that the Soviet security apparatus of that period used routinely to produce the testimony it required. Under that interrogation, the commandant provided a statement that accused Vlasic of a range of misconduct. The statement was documented. It entered the file. It waited. The third layer was political, connecting Vlasic's personal failings to the broader ideological framework of the moment. In the Soviet system, individual corruption was never merely individual. It was always potentially evidence of something larger. enemy sympathies, foreign connections, deliberate sabotage of the state's interests. The political environment of the early 1950s, with its intensifying focus on ideological purity, its revival of mass suspicion, its preparation for what would become known as the Doctor's Plot, provided the framework into which Vlasic's accumulated file could be inserted with maximum effect. The Commission of 1952. In 1952, a commission was formed under Georgy Malenkov, one of Stalin's senior lieutenants and, in the post-war years, a figure of growing importance in the inner circle, to examine the conduct of Vlassic and the organization he ran. The commission's findings were, unsurprisingly, damning. Corruption, financial irregularities, the misappropriation of state resources for personal benefit, drunkenness in the execution of official duties, what the Soviet bureaucratic vocabulary labeled disorderly personal relationships, a phrase that functioned as an umbrella under which almost any behavior involving women outside formal marriage could be placed. The commission documented these findings with the thoroughness of an organization that had been handed its conclusions in advance and tasked with constructing the evidentiary architecture to support them. None of these findings were entirely fabricated. Vlasic had lived for 25 years as a man with enormous informal power and minimal formal accountability. The conditions that produced corruption were present in his situation from the beginning, and he was not the kind of man whose character was strong enough to resist them entirely. But the specific framing, the selection of these facts at this moment presented in this way, was not a neutral act of institutional hygiene. It was a targeted operation. In November of 1952, Vlasic was removed from his position and sent to Asbestos, an industrial city in the Ural region, in what was formally described as a transfer to a lesser administrative role. In practice, it was exile. The message was clear to anyone who understood the grammar of Soviet political signaling. He was being removed from proximity to the center before the final step was taken. The final step came on December 15th, 1952. The black cars, the apartment search, the 14 cameras, the classified documents, the charge of espionage, the letter that sealed it. The formal pretext for Vlasic's arrest contained an element that connected his case to the largest political operation underway in the Soviet Union at that moment. In 1951, a doctor named Lydia Timoshuk had written a letter to the security apparatus alleging that senior Kremlin physicians were engaged in deliberate medical malpractice, that they were, in effect, treating important Soviet figures in ways designed to worsen rather than improve their conditions. This letter was the seed of what would become the Doctor's Plot, the accusation fanned and directed by the political forces around Stalin in late 1952 that a group of primarily Jewish physicians attached to the Kremlin medical establishment had conspired to murder Soviet leaders. Vlasic had received Timoshuk's letter in his capacity as head of the leadership protection apparatus. He had not acted on it. This non-action was incorporated into the charges against him. In the logic of the accusation, his failure to report and pursue Timoshuk's allegations was not merely a bureaucratic oversight. It was evidence of complicity, of deliberate protection of the alleged conspirators, of a cover-up that served foreign interests, of a betrayal of the leader whose safety he was sworn to protect. The charge was a masterpiece of constructed guilt. If Vlasic had acted on the letter, it would have demonstrated that the security apparatus was functioning. By not acting, which was entirely consistent with the way he had always operated, filtering information and managing access according to his own judgment, he had handed his enemies the instrument of his own destruction. What Stalin knew and did not do this is the question that haunts the entire account, the question that Vlasic himself turned over in his prison cell during those months of daily interrogations and staged executions and cold nights in handcuffs. Did Stalin know? Not in the sense of the formal paperwork. Stalin signed documents, received reports, was kept informed of the machinery's operations in the way that a man at the center of absolute power is always simultaneously informed and insulated. But did he understand specifically that the man who had stood beside him for 25 years was being destroyed by a process that had been constructed rather than discovered? The evidence suggests he did, and the evidence suggests he allowed it. Vlassic had written to Stalin more than once from what can be reconstructed. The letters, if they reached Stalin at all, which was itself controlled by the same apparatus that had engineered the arrest, produced no response, no intervention, no signal that the old relationship retained any of the weight that Vlassic had believed for a quarter century that it carried. In his memoirs, Vlassic wrote of his feeling of abandonment with a restraint that makes it more devastating rather than less. He did not rage. He did not accuse. He expressed in the flat language of a man trying to make sense of something that refused to make sense, his inability to understand how the leader had permitted this to happen. The answer that Vlassic could perhaps not fully allow himself to reach, was that the leader had not merely permitted it. The leader had, in the way that Stalin always operated, allowed the machinery to move in the direction it was moving and chosen not to stop it, whether from exhaustion, from the paranoia that had deepened with age, from the manipulation of those around him who controlled the flow of information, or from some calculation that even Vlasic's decades of service could not outweigh. Stalin let it happen. The most loyal man in the Soviet Union had discovered in the most direct possible way the absolute limit of loyalty's protection. He was in a cell. Winter was deepening. And across the city, in the nearby dacha that he had built and staffed and secured and maintained for 25 years, the man he had devoted his life to protecting was, for the first time genuinely, unguarded. The prophecy was already in motion. Neither man knew it yet. But the clock was running. March 1st, 1953. The nearby dacha at Kuntsevo, 12 kilometers west of the Kremlin. The guards had last seen Stalin at approximately 11 o'clock in the evening, when the lights in his private rooms were still on and the sounds of movement confirmed that the occupant was awake. By all established routine, he would summon someone before midnight. A glass of water, a document, some small request that was also in its way a confirmation that he was present and functioning and that the world around him should continue to operate accordingly. No summons came. The guards waited. They had been trained, by years of accumulated protocol, by the institutional memory of what happened to people who made unauthorized decisions in proximity to Stalin, to wait until they were called. The man who had written those protocols, who had trained the first generation of guards who trained this generation, who had established the precise choreography of when to approach and when to stay back and what crossing the threshold without permission meant, that man was in a prison cell on the other side of Moscow. Midnight passed. The early hours of March 2nd came and went. The lights in Stalin's rooms were still on, which the guards interpreted as a sign that he was awake, perhaps working, perhaps simply choosing to keep the lights burning, as he sometimes did. They did not enter. By the afternoon of March 2nd, the silence had lasted long enough that even the paralysis of trained obedience began to crack. A guard finally opened the door. Stalin was on the floor. He had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke so severe that his entire left side was paralyzed. His speech was gone, and consciousness came and went in fragments. He was alive, but barely, and the margin between alive and not was narrowing with every hour that had already passed without medical intervention. Physicians were summoned, the senior medical personnel of the Kremlin establishment, the same physicians who had been accused in the doctor's plot that was still unfolding of conspiring to harm Soviet leaders, were not called. The terror of that accusation was still fresh enough that calling the accused doctors to treat the most important patient in the Soviet Union was unthinkable. Other doctors came instead, competent men placed in an impossible situation, treating a patient whose illness had been progressing for somewhere between 12 and 22 hours before anyone reached him. On March 5th, 1953, at 9:51 in the evening, Joseph Stalin died. He was 74 years old. He had ruled the Soviet Union in practical terms for approximately 3 decades. He had reshaped a country of hundreds of millions of people according to a vision that combined genuine ideological conviction with personal paranoia in proportions that historians continue to argue about. He had industrialized, collectivized, purged, imprisoned, and executed on a scale that the human mind struggles to process as the actions of a single administration rather than of multiple historical epochs compressed together. And in the end, he died on the floor of the dacha that Vlassic had built, unattended for the better part of a day, because the organization of the household had been restructured after the man who built it was removed and the new arrangements did not work as well, and nobody around the dying leader had the authority or the courage to cross the threshold without being called. The prophecy had been exact. Beria's brief hour and its end. In the immediate aftermath of Stalin's death, the Soviet Union entered one of the most genuinely uncertain periods in its history. The machinery of absolute personal rule had been built around a single individual, and that individual was gone. What remained was a collection of powerful, frightened, mutually suspicious men who had spent decades competing for position within a system that had prevented any of them from accumulating the kind of independent authority that would allow a clean succession. Lavrentiy Beria moved fastest. In the hours and days after Stalin's death, he positioned himself at the center of the transition, leveraging his control of the security apparatus to establish a dominant role in the collective leadership that formed to replace Stalin. He had files on everyone. He had personnel in every institution. He had spent 15 years building the infrastructure of control, and now he deployed it. For approximately 100 days, Beria was the most powerful man in the Soviet Union. Then, on June 26, 1953, he was arrested. The other members of the collective leadership, Khrushchev, Malenkov, Bulgan, and Molotov, had concluded with the clarity that survival produces that a man who controlled what Beria controlled could not be safely tolerated in a system that was trying to move away from the extreme of one-man rule. They moved against him in a meeting of the Presidium, with military support organized by Khrushchev and Marshal Zhukov. Beria was charged with treason, espionage, and counter-revolutionary activity, the same categories of accusation that the machinery he had built had applied to thousands of others over the preceding decades. He was tried in December of 1953. He was found guilty. In the final days of that month, in a basement room not so different from the rooms where his own organization had processed its own victims, Lavrentiy Beria was executed. The man who had engineered Vlasic's destruction was gone. Vlasic, however, remained in custody. The dangerous thing about knowing too much. This is the part of the story that most biographical accounts handle briefly, because it is the part that is most uncomfortable to examine closely. Beria was dead. Beria was the political justification for holding Vlasic, his connection to the doctor's plot, his alleged complicity in security failures, his role in a conspiracy that had been orchestrated by Beria's apparatus, had been substantially undermined by the arrest and execution of the man who had orchestrated it. And yet Vlasic sat in custody for 2 more years after Stalin's death. The explanation that emerges from the available evidence is not ideological. It is not legal. It is something simpler and more human. Vlasic knew things. 25 years of standing closer to absolute power than anyone else, closer than marshals, ministers, family members, foreign leaders, had filled him with a kind of knowledge that the new Soviet leadership could not evaluate from a distance. They did not know exactly what he knew. They did not know exactly what he might say, to whom, in what context, and with what consequences. In the calculus of a system that was trying to manage a delicate transition away from Stalinist terror without triggering a full accounting of what that terror had actually consisted of, Vlasic represented an unquantifiable risk. He was not dangerous because of what he might do. He was dangerous because of what he had seen. The new leadership chose caution. The sentence. In January of 1955, more than 2 years after his arrest, nearly 2 years after Stalin's death, Nikolai Vlasik was brought before a tribunal and sentenced. The charge of espionage, the centerpiece of the original arrest, the accusation about the 14 cameras and the classified documents, had not survived scrutiny. It was quietly set aside, which was itself an acknowledgment of what the charge had always been: a construction, a pretext, a legal instrument in service of a political purpose. What remained was a reduced set of charges: abuse of position, corruption, the misuse of state resources. Real enough in their way, the biographical record does not support a portrait of Vlasic as a man of perfect personal integrity, but grotesquely disproportionate as the foundation for what had been done to him. The staged executions, the daily interrogations, the years in solitary confinement, the handcuffs, the psychological dismantling of a man who had given 25 years of total service. The sentence was 10 years of exile. Then it was reduced to 5. He was sent to Krasnoyarsk in Siberia, a city whose name in the geography of Soviet punishment carried its own particular weight. His property was confiscated, his rank was stripped, his party membership removed at the time of his arrest was not restored. In 1956 he was pardoned, not rehabilitated. Pardoned. The distinction mattered. A pardon acknowledged that the punishment was being ended. A rehabilitation would have acknowledged that the punishment should never have happened. The Soviet system of that period was willing to do the first but not yet the second. He returned to Moscow. He was 60 years old. He had no position, no rank, no institutional home. He had his memories and his notebooks, the materials from which, in the years remaining to him, he would write the memoirs that represent one of the most intimate insider accounts of Stalin's private world that the historical record possesses. He died on June 18, 1967. He was 71 years old. He died without official acknowledgement of what had been done to him, without the formal restoration of his name, without the document that would have said in the plain language of the state that had destroyed him that it had been wrong. That document came 33 years later. Rehabilitation, and what it cannot restore. In the year 2000, 47 years after his arrest, 33 years after his death, Nikolai Sidorovich Vlasic was officially rehabilitated by the Russian state. The finding was that his prosecution had been unlawful. The charges had been fabricated or disproportionate. The treatment he received during interrogation had violated even the standards of the system that administered it. The rehabilitation was granted posthumously. There was no one left to hand it to. His daughter, he had a daughter, born of one of the relationships that his enemies had catalogued as evidence of moral disorder, received the document on his behalf. The state that had staged mock executions against her father, that had held him in handcuffs in a solitary cell for months, that had sent him to Siberia and stripped him of everything, handed her a piece of paper saying it was sorry. This is how systems process their crimes when enough time has passed that processing them costs nothing. The question that will not close, we return at the end to the sentence that Vlasic wrote in his cell, the sentence about holding no malice against Stalin, about boundless fidelity, about the incomprehensibility of what had been done to him by the man he had served. It would be easy to read that sentence as the statement of a broken man, of someone whose psychological capacity for honest reckoning had been destroyed by 25 years of complete self-subordination to another human being. And perhaps that reading is not entirely wrong, but there is another way to hold it, as the testimony of a man who understood on some level that what had happened to him was not personal, that it was structural, that the system which had elevated him was the same system that had consumed him, and that the system operated according to its own logic, a logic in which personal loyalty was real but never sufficient, in which proximity to power was always also proximity to the mechanism of destruction, in which the only guaranteed outcome for anyone who entered the innermost circle was that the circle would eventually close around them. Vlasic had understood this. had watched it happen to others, had processed the files, had stood in the rooms where the decisions were made, and had stayed anyway, had served anyway, had believed or chosen to believe that his case would be different. It was not different. The boy from Bobinichi who rose from a 3-room parish school to the right hand of the most powerful man on earth ended his days in a Siberian city with a piece of paper that arrived decades too late to matter to him personally. The prophecy he made, "If I am gone, Stalin will not last long," had been fulfilled with a precision that no one planned and everyone experienced. And the lesson, if there is one lesson in a story this large and this human, is not really about Stalin or Beria or the Soviet system or the specific machinery of the 1950s. The lesson is older than any of those things. It is simply this: the closer you stand to absolute power, the more completely you belong to it. And belonging to it completely means that when it turns, as it always turns, there is no distance left between you and what it does. Nikolai Vlasik stood as close as a human being can stand, and he learned what that means.